I think one of the interesting things about the relationship between sons and fathers is you could read it into what we call the Oedipus complex. You know, the son fated to grow up, murder his father, and marry his mother in order to be king, to attain power, to become um, his father, or perhaps even better than his father. Um, One of the ways, I think that the Superman narrative and also Jesus are different ways that we could look at sacrifice, but ultimately wanting to be that hero. Jesus is, after all, the hero of the story. God does and decides, and God has seems to have little at stake in it. And I find it interesting that often empathy is one of the qualities that is least associated with God, and yet it is most associated with humanity. I mean, it is our ability to sense one another, to know one another, that makes us human. We talk about the five senses and the sixth sense of this sort of empathy, being able to synthesize something from the taste, the hear, the smell, the sound, the touch of the world around us, but to be able to see more than what's readily presented to us um, is that sixth sense. And to what degree people have developed theirs, well, there's even fantasy about the sixth sense. Being able to sense more than what's in this world, be able to sense the future, be able to sense the past, be able to manipulate what one senses. You think of even in X-Men, that character Jean Grey, who could sense everything around her and and ultimately control it. And so that issue of control, of power, of fighting the darkness, which is what Superman is about, fighting evil, which is what ultimately the Bible is about, of conquering evil. Um, and it's also what Buddhism is about, but in a very different way, because it acknowledges that both the good and the evil exist, and they exist in us. So as opposed to outwards, but looking at so I think Christianity works to develop that outward sense of ego, and you have this almost like a hero worship, and I think it is how we look at our fathers. Our fathers are, no matter how flawed or failed they are, there's this complex. I mean, look at how bad poor Oedipus had it. Um, that how he was abandoned by his father. But look at all the other ways that men are abandoned by their fathers, and yet they work to prove themselves to their fathers, to be a better man than their fathers, to treat women how they saw their fathers treat their mother. To see her on one hand as a mother, and on the other side, the whore as Mary of Magdalene, or Mary Jesus' mother, as one or the other. Because we know that, well, by definition of being our father's children, we know that our father, got screwed our mothers. And even though we may never see that, or children may be never be exposed to their parents' sexualities explicitly, our very existence says to us that A, this happened, and then B, the culture around us of sex is such that, well, we have a very poor relationship to sex. So, it becomes another side of male domination. Um, and so I think our relationships with our fathers, both um, as men, give us a sense of domination over the world, over our domains, over the bodies of women, and ultimately at the sacrifice of our own selves. Because the ironic thing about being a man is that we're the least, we're the person we think about the least, ourselves. We mostly think about that ego outside of us, a relationship, what we're projecting onto the others. And the hero narrative, um, I think the hero narrative um, is one way that we can actually visualize how deeply devoted we are to that outside ego as opposed to that inside ego, what Buddhism looks at. And so our relationships to our fathers becomes, we are in a sense trying to slay them, trying to slay that inner ego. We project onto them what we wish for the inside to be, and we see our fathers this um, becomes, I mean, subconsciously becomes the kind of man that we are. Um, but it's also wrapped up in trying to please the father, trying to gain the pride of the father. I mean, There you go. There's the Christian narrative again. But ultimately, that's what even Superman is about. Of being both the best of both his fathers. Being the best American. Clark Kent's adopted parents are good hometown Americans. Small town. The heartland. The best of who we are as Americans. The Kents. And then his biological father, Superman. He's Superman. You save, say we could save our world, so you save our world. Um, his father in the movies is always projected in a very kind of godlike, ethereal way. Very interesting. Of again, of how we see our father, and so unsurprisingly, um, we even, in a sense, humanize God by both seeing ourselves as children of God, His children made in His image. That's again projection of our egos, because we want to see ourselves. We want to look back, look in that mirror of God, and see ourselves as God. And yet, we know that we are too failed to be God. We're just human. And so that's the tension between the internal ego and the external ego, and it gets meted out. And this is one of the ways that we see it. I mean, I've talked about several ways how that's reflected in how masculinity and masculine identity is formed between, well, the two men in the parental relationship, the father and the son. Um, because ultimately we even see that our bodies will grow into being. We're little, dwindling of a kid, but we see this being, this man before us that will become. So it's almost like it is, that's the fate part, the fate narrative. Genetically, we're half our fathers, but then because we are also male like our fathers, we are, you know, that's the male that we see, and our relationship to that male, be he physically present or not, and abandoned physically, or the way that I would say that men abandon our children by not being emotive and emotional and honest with them, not being present, participatory fathers, as people would say. So much so that parenting is almost equated with motherhood. Motherhood is like up there, and fatherhood is like, yeah, I mean, sperm donors and providers, and not just coming home and playing with kids, but like caretaking. Where fatherhood isn't associated with caretaking, and um, I think the resolution to that, well, as I just suggested, the resolution to not having to sacrifice the father, not having to try to become that hero um, of Superman, but the hero of the person who conquers the darkness inside.